For 6 months, my oldest son came up with a new excuse every time I asked to meet his fiancée's parents. Finally, I looked him in the eye and said, "Just dinner. 4 people, 1 table. That's all I'm asking." He smiled, said he understood, promised to call me back in an hour. But he never did. That same night, as I walked past a half-open door, I heard him say to my younger son, in a voice so cold I barely recognized it, "You say nothing to Dad. You say nothing to anyone." I stood frozen. What I heard next made my face turn completely pale. "I'm deeply grateful you're here with me. Drop a comment. Tell me what country or city you're watching from. I'd love to know where this story is reaching." A quick note: this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message it carries is one worth keeping. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, and I almost missed it entirely. It was half buried under a stack of case briefs on my desk. When I came home from the office, a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering that looked wildly out of place among depositions and billing summaries. I set my coat across the chair, loosened my tie, and picked it up the way I might handle a piece of evidence I hadn't cataloged yet. My name was written across the front in clean, deliberate script. Arthur R. Whitfield. No return address. No note tucked inside. Just the card and the date and the name of a hotel I knew well. The Langham, Chicago. June 21st. 6 months. My son was getting married in 6 months, and I had learned about it from the Postal Service. I sat back in my chair and let out a breath that came from somewhere deeper than my lungs. The framed accolades on the walls had been hanging there long enough that I had stopped seeing them. 35 years of other people's gratitude pressed under glass, and collecting the particular stillness of things that no longer need to be noticed. Tonight, they felt smaller than usual. Tonight, the whole room did. Carol Fenwick. My office assistant had left a reminder on my desk about tomorrow's 11 o'clock partnership review. I pushed the note aside and reached for the phone. Michael answered on the 4th ring. His voice was warm and polished, the voice he used in rooms full of people he needed to impress. "Dad, I was just thinking about you." "Were you?" I kept my tone even. "The invitation came today." Good. The venue took forever to confirm. You know how these things go. Emily has been working with the event planner practically every weekend. You're going to love the Langham, Emily." I turned the name over. I had met her once a year and a half ago briefly at a firm dinner where Michael had introduced her as someone he was seeing. She had laughed at something I said about the city's parking situation and asked sharp, curious questions about a case she had read about in the Tribune. I had thought, this one is real. Then the months stretched out, and the invitations to spend more time with them never came, and I had told myself Michael was protective of what he was building. I had told myself a lot of things. "I'd like to meet her parents," I said, "before the wedding. 6 months is enough time for a dinner." A pause. 1 beat, maybe 2, and in 35 years of courtrooms, I had learned that the pauses people believe go unnoticed are the ones that carry the most weight. "They're private people, Dad." His voice had shifted, still smooth but cooler now at the edges, the way a well-rehearsed answer sounds when it's been prepared too far in advance. "Traditional. Big social things aren't really their style. I'll see what I can work out." "I'm not asking for anything big," I said. "Just dinner. 4 people, a table, a meal." "I hear you." He said it the way people say something when they have already decided the answer will be no. "Listen, I've got something going on tonight. Can I call you back in an hour?" He did not call back. I set the phone face down on the desk and pressed my palm flat against the surface, feeling the solid grain of the oak beneath my hand. My chest had begun to ache in the specific, pressurized way it had ached for years, not the sharp strike of a crisis, but the slow, grinding weight of a man who has grown used to conversations that end before they are finished, rooms that echo when they should not, a house with too many doors and not enough voices behind them. Helen Gordy appeared at the study entrance carrying a small coffee tray. She had managed this household for 20 years, had cooked birthday dinners for both boys, had stood beside me in the back pew at Margaret's funeral, had kept this house running with the quiet competence of someone who understood it far better than its owner. She set the tray on the corner of the desk, and her eyes went to the envelope in my hands. Something moved across her face, a quick, complicated recognition, like a person who has been watching a storm gather from a distance and has finally decided to say something. "I thought you might want something warm, sir," she said. Then she pressed her lips together. "There's something I should tell you." I looked up. "Go ahead. Mr. Michael was here last Wednesday evening while you were at the Brennan dinner." She clasped her hands in front of her, and I could see the slight tension in her knuckles, the careful posture of a woman delivering news she wishes she did not have. "He used his key. He spent about an hour in this room. I brought him tea, and he thanked me very politely." She paused, and her voice dropped half a register. "He went through your filing cabinet, sir. The one by the window. He was very careful, put everything back the way he found it. But I noticed because I always notice. The room seemed to contract slightly around me. A cold tightening spread through my chest, moved up into my throat, settled behind my eyes like a pressure that had no clean release. Was there anything new on the desk when he left?" I asked. "Anything he left behind?" "No, sir." Her eyes were steady and serious. "Nothing at all." I looked at the filing cabinet. I looked at the invitation on my desk. I looked at the whiskey decanter on the shelf to my left. A comfort I had reached for most evenings for 8 years since the house went quiet, in the way that houses go quiet when someone essential leaves them forever. My hand moved toward it out of habit. Then I stopped, left it where it was, opened the desk drawer instead, and lifted out the green leather journal that had belonged to Margaret, the one I had kept close for 4 years, without ever writing a single word inside it, not wanting to disturb what she had left there. Tonight, I uncapped my pen, found a blank page near the back, and wrote 4 words. "Something is very wrong." I closed the journal and sat alone in the dark of my study, surrounded by 35 years of victories on the walls, and the slow, certain feeling that the most important case of my life had just announced itself without giving me the name. 8 days after that Tuesday, Michael's car appeared in the driveway at 3:30 in the afternoon. I was still at my desk when I heard it, that particular smooth engine note that he had chosen, I suspected, for exactly the impression it made when it arrived. Through the window, I watched him step out, tall, unhurried, in a charcoal overcoat that fit him the way expensive clothes fit men who have always been comfortable in them. He walked toward the house with the easy confidence of someone who expects the door to open before he has to ask. My chest did not warm the way it once had at the sight of him. I noticed that. Filed it away the way I filed away inconsistencies in testimony without yet assigning meaning. I went to meet him in the hallway. "Dad." He pulled me into a brief, firm embrace and clapped one hand against my back the way men do when the embrace is partly performance. He smelled of cedar and something imported. When he stepped back, his eyes moved around the foyer, appraising, measuring, cataloging, before they settled on me with a smile that reached exactly far enough. "You look well. The house looks exactly the same." "It tends to," I said. "Come in." Helen appeared from the kitchen corridor. "Mr. Michael," she said warmly, the way she greeted both boys, a warmth built from 20 years of birthday dinners and school breaks, and the particular intimacy of knowing someone since they were young. "Can I bring anything?" "Scotch would be wonderful, Helen, thank you so much." He said it without looking at her. His eyes were already on me. I led him to the study. He took the chair directly across from my desk, not the side chair where most visitors sat, but the main guest chair positioned squarely opposite mine, and crossed one leg over the other, with the practiced ease of a man settling into territory. He considers familiar. He produced a gift bottle from under his coat. Single malt 18 years, the label facing me. He placed it between us on the desk like a peace offering, or a deliberate distraction, or both. I wanted to come in person, he said. There are things I think we should talk through before June. All right, I said. Talk. He started with small things, the guest list, the seating chart, a catering detail Emily had spent weeks debating. His voice was warm and careful, and I listened the way I listened to a witness I do not yet trust, attentively, without interrupting, watching for the moment the script started showing through the performance. It came 20 minutes in, right on cue. Dad. He leaned forward and pressed his hands together over one knee, a gesture of sincerity he had been using since he was a teenager and wanted something. There's something I need to tell you, and I want you to hear what I mean, not just how it sounds at first. Every muscle in my back went rigid. I kept my face still. He reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat and placed a sealed manila folder on the desk between us. He did not open it. He set it down and left it there the way a dealer lays a card face down on the table. A few months ago, he said, I started noticing some things. Changes, gaps, moments where you seemed off. It worried me enough that I reached out to a physician, a man named Dr. Voss out of Evanston. He reviewed some documentation and... Michael exhaled slowly, performing the exhale of a man carrying something painful. The picture isn't encouraging, Dad. I've been trying to find the right moment to talk to you about it. With the wedding coming, with Emily's parents asking questions about the family. What kind of questions? I asked. They want to understand what they're bringing Emily into. His voice stayed measured, practiced steady. They're traditional people, they take family stability seriously. And the truth is, I've started looking at care facilities. Good ones in Lake Forest. Quiet, private, excellent staff. Places where I'd know you were taken care of properly, and where the family's situation would look. You want to put me in a nursing home, I said. The words came out flat. Not a question. I want you safe. He met my eyes, and his own were steady and earnest and completely unreadable. From a legal standpoint, with the documentation Dr. Voss provided, I could file a petition for guardianship with the court. In Illinois, the process isn't, I know the process. My voice dropped to the register I used when I wanted a jury to pay close attention. I've represented clients in guardianship proceedings for 30 years. In Illinois, a petition requires a formal clinical evaluation conducted by a licensed psychiatric specialist, not a general practitioner, not a referral letter, not a summary report from someone whose credentials I haven't verified. A general practitioner's opinion does not meet the legal threshold. A petition filed without proper standing gets dismissed at the preliminary hearing. I looked at the folder on the desk. I haven't opened that yet, but I will tell you right now that if it came from a GP rather than a psychiatrist, it is not worth the paper it was printed on. Something moved across Michael's face, not quite surprise, but a rapid, quiet recalibration, like a man adjusting a calculation he thought was finished. He had come in expecting me to be frightened. I was frightened. I simply refused to wear it where he could see it. Dad, is there anything else? I asked. He looked at the desk. A breath passed between us. Then he said, Emily's parents made a request. Before they'd formally approved the marriage. He paused exactly one beat. $200,000. A financial guarantee as a show of good faith. I covered it. I didn't want you to feel pressured. But you should know. My hands stopped moving on the desk. Completely. The cold that had been building in my chest for the last 20 minutes hit something solid. $200,000. I had never spoken to the Coltons. I had never been introduced, never shared a meal, never been given the opportunity to make any impression at all, good or bad. And now I was being told they had placed a price on their daughter. And Emily, Michael continued, and his voice shifted again, softer now, wounded in a way that landed differently than the rest of it. She's afraid of you, Dad. I don't know exactly where it started, but she's built this image of you as someone who controls everything, who can't release anything he's claimed as his. I've tried to reassure her, but she doesn't feel safe yet. He met my eyes. I'm trying to protect her from that fear. He stood, adjusted his coat, smiled that smooth, finished smile that gave nothing back. Think about what I've said. We can talk more before the wedding. There's time. I walked him to the door. Helen was in the corridor. As Michael moved toward the front entrance, her back to him, her eyes found mine, and the expression on her face was one I had never seen there before. Not alarm. Something quieter, and in its quietness much colder. A woman who had been waiting a long time to confirm something she already knew. The front door closed. I went back to my desk, opened the manila folder, and read the single page inside. It claimed I had exhibited observable cognitive irregularities and episodes of pronounced confusion. It was signed by Dr. Elliot Voss of Voss Medical Associates, Evanston, a name I did not recognize. The document used terminology I had seen in hundreds of psychiatric assessments over the years, used it slightly wrong in the slightly wrong order, the way someone uses a technical language they have learned to approximate, rather than one they truly understand. No examination date. No patient signature. No countersignature from a supervising specialist. I read it 3 times. Each pass my mind caught another flaw. I did not open the scotch Michael had left on the desk. I opened the drawer, took out Margaret's journal, and found the page where I had written 4 words 3 nights ago. Beneath them, I wrote one more. No. The morning after Michael left, I was in my car before the city had properly woken up. Dr. Nathaniel Greer had been my personal physician for 14 years, a quiet, deliberate man in his mid-60s who had built his practice on the same principle I had built my career on, that shortcuts always cost more than they save. His office was on the 12th floor of the Galter Pavilion at Northwestern Memorial, overlooking the lake, and his waiting room was always too warm and smelled faintly of old magazines. I had sat in that waiting room during the worst years after Margaret died, and Greer had spoken to me plainly and without softening things, which was exactly what I had needed then, and exactly what I needed now. His receptionist waved me through without a scheduled appointment. Greer was at his desk when I pushed the door open, and he looked up over the rim of his glasses with the particular expression of a man whose instincts have been doing something without his permission. Arthur. He gestured to the chair. You look like you haven't slept. I need a professional opinion, I said. On a document someone presented to me as a medical assessment. I placed on his desk the folder Michael had left behind and pushed it across. He lifted it, read it the way he read everything slowly, without skipping his index finger tracing each line. After 2 full minutes, he set it down and removed his glasses entirely. On Nathaniel Greer, that gesture was the equivalent of a raised voice. Where did this come from, he asked. My son. He presented it as the basis for a guardianship petition. Greer's jaw tightened. He pressed 2 fingers to the top of the page and held them there. Arthur, the physician listed here, Voss Evanston, is registered as a general practitioner, a family doctor. The condition described in this document, he tapped the line, would require a formal neuropsychiatric evaluation, multiple sessions, a licensed psychiatrist or neurologist, not a GP, not a summary letter, not a referral, a documented clinical battery. He slid the page toward me and pointed. Beyond that, the diagnostic code used here is outdated. The ICD-10 classification was updated in 2019. This code was retired. Whoever wrote this is working from a textbook that is at least 15 years old. He paused, and his voice dropped. And there is no examination date anywhere on this document. No record that you were ever seen by this physician. No patient signature. I have never met a Dr. Voss in my life, I said. Greer stood up. He moved to his computer with the clipped, purposeful stride of a man who has made a decision. I am pulling your complete medical record right now. 14 years of documentation. I want a certified copy prepared and signed within the hour. He typed without looking at me. Your last full cognitive screening was 18 months ago, Arthur. I administered it myself. Normal across every measure. Your blood pressure is managed. Your neurological history is clean. He turned to look at me over his shoulder, and his face had lost its clinical distance entirely. I want you to understand what I am telling you. That document is fabricated. It is not a legitimate medical assessment by any standard I recognize. And if that man's name is Voss, and he signed it, he will answer for it. 40 minutes later, I walked out of Northwestern Memorial with a sealed envelope containing a certified counter-record on hospital letterhead, 14 years of clean medical history, countersigned and stamped by the hospital's records office. Greer walked me to the elevator himself, which he had never done before. If anyone attempts to use that Voss document in any legal proceeding, he said, call me. I will appear in person. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat beside me. The sky over Lake Michigan was the color of old pewter low, and pressing the kind of December sky that makes the city feel smaller than it is. That evening I was in the study when I heard the garage door open. I assumed Helen was back from an errand. I did not look up from my reading. 20 minutes later, on my way to the kitchen, I heard voices behind the sitting room door. I stopped. The door was not fully closed, a gap of 3 inches, and through it Leo's voice. My younger son, 22 years old, whom I had not spoken to properly in months, whom I had told myself was simply busy with school and his own life, whom I had not looked for hard enough, and now found like this through a gap in a door I had not intended to approach. His voice was uneven, scraped thin at the edges, the way a voice gets when a person is trying to hold something together that is already breaking apart. Michael, please. I'm not going to say anything. I haven't said anything. Why do you keep coming here? Because I need to be certain. Michael's voice was nothing like the voice he had used in my study the day before. That voice had been warm and rehearsed and precise. This voice had none of that. It was flat and cold and completely without warmth, the voice of a man who has stopped performing because he does not believe anyone important is watching. You keep the drive where I told you to keep it. You say nothing to Dad. You say nothing to anyone. That is the only thing I am asking. I don't even know what's on it. Leo's voice cracked. I've never looked at it. I just want to be left out of. You are already in it. Each word dropped cleanly separately. And if you open your mouth to Dad, to anyone, I will make sure that Emily's family loses everything they have. Every cent. I know how to do it. You know that I do. A pause that felt deliberate, measured. Do we understand each other? What came next from behind that door was not a word. It was a sound, the kind of sound a person makes when they have been pushed past a boundary. They did not know they had a small, compressed exhale of pain and helplessness that I had not heard from my younger son since he was 14 years old and sitting in a hospital corridor waiting to hear about his mother. My palm was pressed flat against the hallway wall. I did not remember doing that. The tightening in my chest was not rage. It was not fear. It was something older than both the specific, unbearable weight of a father who has heard his child in pain through a door and understands with total clarity that walking through it right now would destroy the only chance he has to stop all of this properly. I walked back to the study, sat down, heard the garage door again 15 minutes later, Michael leaving. Then I picked up my phone. I scrolled to a name I had not dialed in 14 years, Conrad Mallory. Former Chicago Police Department detective, now a licensed private investigator. A man I had worked alongside during a complex financial fraud case in 2010. A man I had watched stay calm and methodical under conditions that had rattled everyone else in the room. A man I trusted in the specific way you trust someone you have seen choose integrity when choosing otherwise would have been easier. My thumb rested over his name. Then I set the phone down on the desk, face up, his name still visible on the screen. Not yet. I was a lawyer. I knew what happened when you moved before your evidence was ready. You handed the other side a reason to make everything you had collected inadmissible. I needed something more concrete before I made that call, something that would hold in the light. But I left the phone lying face up. Conrad Mallory's name on the screen, visible in the dark of the study, waiting. That was a decision too. 3 weeks is a long time to sit with what you know. I had gone to the office every day in those 3 weeks. I had reviewed briefs, attended meetings, signed documents, spoken to clients whose problems felt oddly uncomplicated compared to my own. Nobody noticed anything different about me, which told me I was performing normal at a higher level than I had realized I was capable of. Carol Fenwick scheduled my calendar. Ed Crane managed 2 depositions without needing me. Life at Whitfield and Associates continued its ordinary rotation, and I sat inside it like a man waiting for a fire to reach him. On the evening of January 7th, I got in the car and drove to Wicker Park. Leo lived in a 4-story walk-up on North Damon Avenue, a building that announced itself with old plaster and radiator heat, and the accumulated smell of a dozen different households going about their lives behind thin walls. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and stood outside apartment 3C. I knocked. Nothing came back. I knocked a second time. Long pause. Then the quiet creak of footsteps, slow, reluctant, the specific rhythm of a person deciding whether to pretend they were somewhere else entirely. I made a decision. I set my briefcase down, unbuttoned my coat from the bottom without removing it, and sat down on the hallway floor with my back against the wall beside his door. 60 years old. Named partner at a firm with my name on the building. Sitting on a worn carpet in a Wicker Park hallway at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, because it was the only thing I could think of that might actually work. I waited. 12 minutes passed. Then 25. I could hear movement behind the door, small adjustments. A presence circling closer and retreating. At 38 minutes, the lock turned. Leo stood in the doorway and looked at me on the floor. He was thinner than the last time I had seen him at Christmas a year ago, briefly, over a meal that none of us spoke honestly through. The hollows under his eyes were deep enough to cast shadows. His hair was overlong, and his sweatshirt had a UIC logo faded almost to nothing, and he was holding the collar closed with one hand. He looked at me with the expression of a person who has carried something so long they have gone numb from the weight of it, and who does not know how to respond when someone finally arrives to help carry it. "Dad!" His voice came out broken at both ends. I stood up and looked at him directly. "I am not here to ask questions," I said. "I'm here because I should have been here a long time ago, and I'm sorry that I wasn't." His face came apart all at once, not gradually, not with restraint, but completely, the way a wall fails when the structure beneath it gives way. He turned back into the apartment, and I followed. 1 room and a kitchen alcove. Textbooks stacked in columns on the floor because the shelves had run out of room. 3 takeout containers on the counter, a jar of instant coffee, a stack of unopened mail, a desk buried under printouts, and on the windowsill, 4 prescription pill bottles, the child-proof caps still sealed untouched. I looked at those bottles and felt something move through me that had no clean name but that began somewhere behind my sternum and spread cold in every direction. Leo made 2 mugs of coffee from the instant jar, his hands trembling slightly as he passed one to me. We sat at the small kitchen table, barely enough room for 2 chairs, and he wrapped his fingers around the mug, and started to talk. He started showing up in October. Leo set his eyes on the table. No warning, no call first. He'd say he was in the neighborhood. Michael is never in anyone's neighborhood by accident. He pressed the rim of the mug against his lower lip. At first, he'd stay an hour and talk about nothing in particular. Then it changed. He started asking about you, what you were working on, who you were spending time with, whether you'd mentioned him. And if I said I didn't know he'd get this look. Leo shook his head, like he was making a calculation. What did he ask you to do? I said. Leo's voice went thin. Keep quiet. Not ask questions. He gave me something to hold, told me not to look at it, and not to show anyone. He pushed back his chair and stood. He moved the kitchen table a few inches to the side, knelt on the floor, and pressed his fingertips to the edge of one particular floorboard. It lifted. Beneath it, in the gap between the subfloor and the joists, there was a coffee can. Inside the can, a black external hard drive in a sealed plastic freezer bag. He held it out to me. Both his hands were shaking. He gave me this 8 months ago, Leo said. Last May. He said if I showed anyone, he'd know. I don't know how he'd know. I've thought about it 100 times. But I believed him. He swallowed hard. I haven't opened it. I haven't looked at what's on it. His eyes finally met mine, red at the rims and raw. I'm scared of what's on it, Dad. I took the drive carefully and set it on the table between us. Is there anything else? I said. Anything he said that struck you as different even by Michael's standard? Leo rubbed the back of his neck. The safe, he said. In your study at the house. He's been going in there a lot over the past 2 years, always with a reason. Using the printer, looking for something he'd left. But I'd see him enter the combination when he thought I wasn't in the hallway. He's careful about everything, Michael. But he wasn't careful enough about checking first. You filmed it, I said. Leo looked up sharply. How did you? I didn't, I guessed. He exhaled through his nose, a long, unsteady breath. 3 times. On my phone. Over the last 2 years. I don't know why I kept doing it. I just had this feeling that I should. That it would matter for some reason I couldn't explain yet. He looked at the drive on the table. I still don't know if I did the right thing keeping any of this. I didn't know what Michael was doing. I just knew that something about the way he moved through this house wasn't right. I wasn't recording evidence. I was recording the feeling that someday someone would need to see what I was seeing. I reached across the small table and pressed my hand over both of his. Leo's breath caught, and then something in him unlocked, and he lowered his face and wept in the full, unguarded way that young men do when they have been strong for too long, in entirely the wrong direction. His shoulders shook. I kept my hand over his and said nothing that would have interrupted the necessary work of that release. When he steadied himself, he looked up at me with eyes that were red and exhausted, and for the first time since he had opened the door, a fraction less afraid. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. I picked up my phone, scrolled to the name I had spent 3 weeks circling without dialing. Pressed call. 3 rings. A voice I recognized across 14 years of silence, Conrad Mallory. Conrad. I stood up and moved toward the window, lowering my voice. It's Arthur Whitfield. I need your help, and everything we discuss stays between us until I say otherwise. A pause. Not surprise assessment. Then, it's been a while, Arthur. Tell me what you've got. 1 week after the call with Conrad, my office phone rang at 8 in the morning. Ed Crane's voice had a quality I had learned to recognize over 25 years of working beside him. A careful, leveled-out evenness that he only used when he was holding something he did not want to drop. Arthur, are you in the building yet? Walking through the door now, I said. Come to my office. Close the door behind you. Ed Crane was 62 years old, and had been at Whitfield and Associates since the year I made partner, long enough to have opinions about the conference room furniture and long enough to usually be right. He read contracts the way a watchmaker reads a mechanism piece by piece, looking for the component that doesn't belong. In 25 years, he had never called me into his office. I had always been the one who called him. His door was closed when I arrived. I pushed it open and found him standing behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The posture of a man who has been working at something for longer than he intended and has stopped pretending there's a comfortable way to deliver what he's found. 3 folders sat across his desk in a row, arranged with the deliberateness of things that had been placed with care. "These came through compliance review," he said. 3 real estate transfer contracts executed over the last 14 months, each one drawn from a separate property trust that lists you as the grantor. Settlement amounts total just over $400,000 combined. He tapped the center folder. The receiving entity on all 3 is a company called Whitfield Capital, LLC. "I have never heard of that company," I said. The words came out steadier than the feeling behind them deserved. I assumed not. Ed met my eyes. There was no judgment in them, only the precise, grieved focus of a man who has confirmed something he hoped was wrong. "Because in 25 years, Arthur, I'd have handled your signature more times than I can accurately count. These," he opened the first folder and turned it toward me, "are very close, but they are not yours. The pen pressure drops off in the first 3 letters of every second page. Your capital W has always been a flat double arch. These drop below the baseline, every single one. And your date notation uses numerals for the month. Every document here spells the month in full." I pulled the folder toward me, looked at my own name written again and again across 3 sets of pages in a hand that was almost mine, close enough to fool a closing attorney, close enough to pass a notary stamp, close enough to move $400,000 without triggering a single alarm. Someone had practiced my signature in private, with patience and precision, until they could borrow it well enough to spend it. Something turned in my chest. Not rage yet, that would come later. First, there was only the peculiar, disorienting vertigo of looking at something that claimed to be you and was not. 35 years of a name built deliberately, case by case, with what I believed was integrity. And someone had duplicated it in secret and used it to build something I had never sanctioned. My hand rested flat and motionless on the open folder. "Who else has seen these?" I said. "No one. I came directly to you." He straightened his cuffs in a gesture that was habitual and self-contained. "I ran a basic search this morning on Whitfield Capital, LLC, Delaware registration. The registered agent is a law firm in Wilmington, the kind of firm that does nothing but serve as a front address for entities that don't want to be found. Actual ownership is behind at least 2 additional holding structures. The chain would require legal process to crack open properly." He lowered his voice, though we were alone behind a closed door. "Whoever built this designed it to take time to trace, and they put your name on the outside of it." "Say nothing to anyone," I said. "Not compliance, not the partners, not yet. I need a week." I gathered the 3 folders. "Ed, thank you, I mean that." He gave one small, firm nod. He did not ask what I was going to do with them or why I needed a week before involving anyone else. That was the quality that had kept him beside me for a quarter century. He knew when to trust the process, without needing to see every step of it. That evening, I took the folders to a bar in Lincoln Square. Conrad Mallory was already at the corner table. When I came through the door, a man in his mid-50s, compact and unhurried, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years reading situations before reacting to them. I recognized it from 2010 from a financial fraud case we had worked adjacent to each other for 14 months, in which he had not made a single unnecessary move. He was drinking club soda. He stood slightly when I sat down. Old habit. He had never lost it. and looked at the 3 folders I set between us, with the eyes of a man already 3 questions ahead. "The LLC," I said. "What did you find?" "Delaware filing 22 months ago." He opened his notebook, actual paper which he preferred. "Old police habits. Ownership runs through 2 intermediate holding companies. The money trail ends at a Cayman Islands trust account, and in the Cayman Islands accessing trust records requires a court order from a jurisdiction that has reciprocal legal agreements with the territory. Without federal involvement, the account is effectively closed to us." He looked at the folders. "But the structure itself tells a story. This was not built quickly. Someone designed it at least 18 months before the first transaction ran through it. They were planning this before they were ready to use it." I opened the first folder and turned it toward him. He looked at the signature line for 4 seconds, then said, "Forged," with the clean, unornamented certainty of a man who has identified thousands of things in his life and long since stopped softening his conclusions. "Ed Crane caught it this morning," I said. 25 years of reading my handwriting." Conrad nodded. He did not express surprise. "I'll need more time to trace the real estate chain fully. But," he set his pen down and looked at me directly, "there's something else. The Colton family. Emily." He said both names with a careful deliberateness that told me he had thought about how to deliver this. "She's been told you have a pattern of controlling behavior," he said. "That Margaret's death left you in a difficult psychological state. That you've involved yourself in Michael's professional decisions in ways that harmed him. She has no basis to doubt it. From everything I can observe through legal means, she has only ever received one source on the subject of who you are." He paused. "She is not your enemy, Arthur. She doesn't know enough to be." I looked at the bar top in front of me. I was not angry at her. That surprised me slightly. What I felt was something closer to a deep, settled grief for a woman who was happy and planning a wedding and believed things about me that were not true and who had no reason yet to question them. "There's also a name," Conrad said, reclaiming my attention. "Garrett Holm. He reached out to me 3 weeks ago. He wouldn't say how he found me, but he has documents connected to Whitfield Capital and says he hasn't known what to do with them for 8 months. He waited because he didn't know who was behind it." Conrad slid a torn page across the table. A phone number handwritten. "He was with your firm, wasn't he?" "Before he opened his own practice." "River North," I said. "He left 12 years ago. He said the documents concern you specifically. He said he needed to know it was safe to come forward." I looked at the number. My chest was tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was the tightening of something beginning to take shape, a structure of facts acquiring its own weight and coherence. I picked up my phone. 2 days after I called him, I was sitting across from Garrett Holm for the first time in 12 years. His office in River North had the particular order that lawyers build when they have deliberately chosen a quieter practice: 3 walls of books, a clean desk, good north-facing light. He had aged the way careful men age, evenly, without drama. His hair had gone fully silver since I had last seen him, and he wore a dark suit with no unnecessary detail, the kind of suit that communicates by not asking for attention. He stood when I came in and shook my hand with both of his. That told me something about the weight he had been carrying. "I should have come to you 8 months ago," he said before I could say anything at all. "Tell me what you have," I said. "We'll deal with the rest after." He had prepared folders tabbed, labeled each document, run through a certified copy process. He placed them on the desk in the order he intended to discuss them, which was the order of a man who had spent 8 months making sense of something that frightened him. He walked me through the contracts first. 3 transactions, each drawn from a separate property trust, listing me as the grantor, each carrying a signature he had flagged before he understood the implications. He pointed to specific details with a pen notary, timestamps, that did not align with the filing dates on record transfer amounts, structured to fall just beneath the threshold that would have triggered automatic bank reporting and settlement funds that routed consistently into Whitfield Capital LLC. "I was contacted last January," he said, "by a representative of the entity, no name given, only a phone number, and a request to review closing documentation on a Lake County property. I didn't recognize the signature irregularity at the time. I identified it 6 weeks later when I pulled the full record from my own files and compared it against documents from our working years together." He met my eyes directly. "I still have the briefs from the Kaminsky case, Arthur. The ones you signed in 2012. I pulled them and set them next to these." He tapped the folder. "They are not the same hand." I kept my voice measured. "What did you do when you realized?" "Documented everything I had." He set his pen down and pressed his hands flat on the desk, the posture of a man making a confession he has rehearsed and still finds difficult. "And then I waited, because I didn't know who was behind it. I didn't know if coming to you directly was safe or whether doing so would close a door I couldn't reopen. So I organized and I sat on it, and I told myself I was being cautious." He exhaled slowly through his nose. "When Conrad Mallory reached out 3 weeks ago, I understood that you were already in motion. That's when I knew it was time to stop being cautious and start being useful." "I'm glad you reached out," I said. It was true, and it was also the most I could say without losing the thread of control I was holding onto with some effort. "I'll need certified copies of everything. Every document, every notation, every piece of correspondence from that phone number." "Already prepared," he said, and gestured to a second folder set to his left. "I anticipated you'd ask. I asked to use the restroom. A simple, genuine request. I needed 60 seconds outside that room." In the corridor 20 feet from Garrett's door, there was a document shredder on a stand beside a recycling bin. The shredder's feed tray was empty. The bin was not. Near the top, slightly crumpled and folded in half, was a single sheet of standard white printer paper. I unfolded it and smoothed it flat against the wall. My stomach dropped the way it drops when you encounter something that should not exist. "Arthur R. Whitfield." Written in rows across the full width of the page, 24 times, by my count, in a hand that was not mine. The first 8 attempts were visibly wrong, the W too sharp and angular, the final lowercase d curling in the wrong direction, the H in Arthur extending too high above the midline. The next 10 were closer. The final 6 were nearly indistinguishable from my actual signature. If I had not been looking at my own name written by my own hand 10,000 times over 35 years, I might not have caught the residual differences in the last row at all. Someone had sat down somewhere private and practiced being me, had crossed out the failures and tried again, had refined it across 24 attempts with the focused patience of a person who fully intended to use it not once but repeatedly in legally binding documents until the habit of my own name had become theirs. I folded the page into quarters and pressed it into the inside breast pocket of my jacket. Then I stood in the hallway with my back against the wall for a moment, not because I was close to losing composure, but because I needed to understand something clearly before I went back into that room. This was no longer only a financial crime. This was deliberate, sustained, personal. Whoever had written those rows of my name had looked at Arthur Whitfield and decided that what I had built over 60 years of living was something they could inhabit without my permission. I went back into Garrett's office. "The ownership chain," I said, "as far as you traced it. Whitfield Capital LLC to a holding company registered in the British Virgin Islands." Garrett turned to the last page in the second folder. "From there to a Cayman Islands trust account. The trust requires a formal court petition under international banking reciprocity agreements to open it, is not accessible through private investigation without federal legal authority. But the British Virgin Islands entity has a director of record. He tapped the line. A name, which will matter the moment someone with jurisdiction pulls the full registration file. Certify everything, I said, standing. Every page. If this goes where I believe it's going, you'll be a material witness. I'll need you ready. I'll be ready? He said. And the steadiness in his voice told me he meant it, that 8 months of sitting with this had resolved into something that looked like relief. I walked out through his lobby and into the parking garage. I sat in the car with the engine off and drew the folded page from my breast pocket one more time. Opened it across the steering wheel. Looked at the final row, 6 signatures, each one almost perfect, arranged like a finished proof. My hands were not shaking. I did not expect them to be. I had learned a long time ago to keep the shaking for later, when no one was watching. I called Conrad. I found the how, I said. Someone practiced my signature until they could pass it anywhere. Documented deliberation, not impulse, not accident. This was preparation. I started the engine. Now find me who made the medical records, the Voss document. I need the person behind the signature on that paper. Conrad answered without a pause, 9 days. Conrad Mallory delivered on 9 days exactly. He called me at 7 in the morning on February 5th from his office line, not his cell, which meant he had been there since before sunrise, and intended that to be understood. I parked on Wacker Drive 40 minutes later and took the stairs to the 4th floor. His office was a small, organized space that looked like a man's thinking rather than his image. A wall of binders, 2 monitors, a city map with pins in it, a coffee maker that was always on and never offered to anyone. He was standing at the map when I came in. He turned and pointed to a pin on the North Shore. Evanston, he said. Dr. Elliot Voss, this afternoon. He briefed me standing up the way he always worked when information was urgent. 4 wire transfers over 4 months each, originating from a Whitfield Capital LLC bank account, totaling $47,000. Each transfer had passed through an intermediate regional account in Naperville before reaching Voss's personal checking, an unnecessary routing step that served only to put distance between the source and the destination. Someone had been careful about it. Not careful enough. The gambling debt, Conrad said, pulling a second page, is $180,000. Accumulated across 3 casinos, 1 in Hammond, Indiana, 2 in the greater Chicago area. He's been carried by a private collection agency since September of 2023, which means he was in active financial distress for at least 15 months before the first wire arrived. He looked at me steadily. Michael did not find Voss through coincidence. He identified a man who was desperate and selected him for exactly that reason. I had suspected this. Confirmed knowledge is different from suspicion in a way that is difficult to explain and impossible to unfeel. The cold that had been building in my chest over the past 2 months settled deeper and became something harder. We drove to Evanston in Conrad's car. Voss Medical Associates occupied the ground floor of a quiet professional building on Davis Street. The waiting room had 6 chairs and a plant that needed water. Behind the reception partition sat a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed to the top of her forehead and the watchful, composed expression of someone who has been anticipating a specific kind of visitor and made peace with that anticipation ahead of time. She looked up when we came through the door. Conrad held up his private investigator credentials. She glanced at them, then reached under the counter and placed a sealed envelope on the partition ledge before either of us had said a single word. "My name is Donna Stills," she said crisply and without prelude. "I have been Dr. Voss's receptionist for 9 years. The younger Mr. Whitfield, the one with the dark overcoat, visited after hours 3 times between August and October of last year. Dr. Voss asked me to leave early each of those evenings. The first time I thought nothing of it. The second time I noticed his hands were shaking when he walked me to the door. The third time I went to my car, sat in it for a few minutes, and then wrote down the date, the time, and the license plate of the vehicle parked in the staff space. She pushed the envelope forward. That is a written statement. I had it notarized at the UPS store on Oak Street last Tuesday. Conrad took the envelope. Thank you, Ms. Stills. She looked at him squarely. I've worked for that man for 9 years, she said. I know the difference between private and wrong. Voss was in his private office at the back of the building. He was 51 years old and looked that afternoon like a man who had been 51 for quite a long time, puffy around the eyes, his color uneven, wearing the compressed, depleted quality of someone for whom sleep had stopped doing what it was supposed to do. When Conrad placed the wire transfer records on the desk in front of him, Voss looked at them. He looked at them for 38 seconds. I counted without meaning to. Then his shoulders fell, not slowly, not in stages, but all at once, completely, the way a structure gives when the load has exceeded what it was ever meant to carry. A sound came out of him, not a word, not quite a breath, something between the two, something that had been waiting behind his ribs for months. How much do you know? His voice was barely above a murmur. Enough, Conrad said. Walk us through the rest. And Voss did. Without hesitation, without evasion, with the hollow, exhausted openness of a man for whom confession has stopped feeling like a loss and started feeling like the only possible form of rest. Michael had made contact through a casino collection broker, a fact Voss delivered with the particular shame of someone who has had sufficient time to understand precisely how he was targeted. The terms had been explicit, $47,000 against $180,000 owed in exchange for one document. 1 page. A clinical summary with his genuine credentials on it formatted to suggest a professional assessment without being specific enough to constitute a fully traceable medical record. He had tried to make it close enough to be useful and vague enough to be deniable. He had miscalculated on the second part. Conrad set an affidavit on the desk. The notary he had arranged waiting in the corridor came in at his signal. Voss signed without being asked twice. His hand pressed hard on the pen as though the pressure itself was necessary. I was already standing, already turning toward the door, when Voss spoke again. Mr. Whitfield. I stopped. My back was to him. There is one thing I need you to know. His voice broke on the final word, and then steadied again. After the first contact, after Michael first called me, I checked the date afterward. Something about the call stayed with me, and I wanted to understand what it was. A pause that landed in the room with considerable weight. It was the 1-year anniversary of your wife's passing, sir. That was the date he chose to make the first approach. The air in the office changed. My hand found the doorframe. I pressed my palm flat against the painted wood, solid and real, something to push against. I stood that way without speaking. In my chest behind my ribs, something was happening that I could not have described precisely and would not have tried to. I thought of Margaret. I thought of the year that had just passed since she had left this world. A year I had spent at my desk in courtrooms in an empty house trying to do the work of grieving in an orderly fashion. And then I thought of Michael sitting somewhere deliberate and calm, choosing that particular date to place his first call. Whether it was coincidence or intention, I could not know. I discovered that not knowing was the hardest part. Thank you, doctor, I said. The words came out level. I was mildly surprised by that. I walked down the corridor and through the waiting room and out onto Davis Street without stopping. The February cold pressed against my face like an open hand. I got into Conrad's car and sat in the passenger seat and looked through the windshield at the bare trees lining the block. My jaw ached from being held clenched. I made myself release it. Conrad came out 5 minutes later, settled into the driver's seat, and looked at me one quick, careful glance before turning to face forward. I'll call Webb now, he said quietly. Open the preliminary file. Wire fraud, healthcare fraud. The affidavit gives us what we need for standing. Do it, I said. He dialed. When Detective Marcus Webb picked up 12 years on the Chicago Police Department, the last 4 running economic crimes investigations. A man Conrad had worked beside during his time on the force and trusted precisely because of it, Conrad gave him the summary in clean, consecutive sentences, then listened, then said, "Yes, there's more. A hard drive with additional documentation that hasn't been formally processed yet. We'll move on that in the next week." He looked at me sideways. "With the right chain of custody this time." He ended the call. "Once this is logged," Conrad said, "we can't pull it back." "I know," I said. The clock started the night I sat outside Leo's door in that hallway. This is just the first time it has an official name. Before I go any further, drop "still here" in the comments so I know you haven't left me. Every comment tells me this story is reaching you. A note: the chapters ahead contain some fictional elements crafted for storytelling and educational purposes. If that's not something you'd like to hear, this is a good place to stop. But if you're staying, what comes next will make it worth it. 9 days after Voss signed that affidavit, Conrad and I drove back to Wicker Park. This visit was different from the first one. I had called ahead. Leo knew we were coming. When we pushed through the building's outer door at 7 in the evening, Leo's apartment was already open before we knocked. He was standing in the doorway, with 3 mugs on the counter behind him and a coffee machine on the kitchen shelf that I had not seen in January. A proper one, with a filter basket and a cord. Small things, but I noticed them. The apartment was the same size, the textbooks still in columns on the floor, but the columns were organized now rather than simply accumulated. The counters were clear, and the windowsill where in January 4 prescription bottles had sat sealed and untouched and told me things I hadn't known how to respond to was empty. I didn't ask. I let the absence mean what it meant. Conrad set his equipment bag on the kitchen table and began unpacking methodically. A laptop, a small black rectangular device with cable ports on 3 sides, a sealed evidence bag still in its packaging, latex gloves, a handwritten log form. He laid each item out with the deliberate care of a man who understands that how you do something in a room like this will matter later in a room that looks nothing like it. "Before anything gets touched," Conrad said, addressing both Leo and me, but orienting himself slightly toward Leo, "I want to be clear about what we're doing and why we're doing it exactly this way." He held up the small black device. "This is a write blocker. When I connect the drive through it to my laptop, the drive can be read, but nothing can be written back to it. The original is preserved completely unchanged. What I'll analyze afterward is a forensic image, a precise bit-for-bit copy. In federal court, this is the accepted standard for handling digital evidence. It's called chain of custody." He set the device down. "Every step we take tonight gets documented. Who touched it when, in what condition. If this ever goes before a judge, there are no gaps in the record for anyone to question." Leo was leaning against the counter with both hands wrapped around his mug, listening with the focused attention of someone who is trying to understand the thing that is going to change his life. "What would have happened if I had just handed it to the police directly?" he asked. "Then there'd be no documentation of what was on it before anyone else touched it," Conrad said. "Defense attorneys build entire strategies on gaps like that. This way, there are no gaps." Leo looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He set his mug down on the counter, moved the kitchen table a few inches to the left, the way he had in January, and knelt on the floor without hesitation. The floorboard came up the same way it had the first time, fingers to the edge, a practiced lift. But this time Leo's hands were not shaking. They had been shaking in January, I remembered it precisely. Tonight, they were steady with the particular steadiness of a person who has made a decision and arrived at some kind of peace with what it costs. He lifted the coffee can from the gap in the subfloor, reached inside, and placed the drive in its original sealed plastic bag on the table between us. Conrad began photographing before touching anything. The open floorboard, the coffee can, the bag, the drive after it was removed. He noted the manufacturer, the model number, and the serial number in his handwritten log, signed it, dated it in the margin, and set it beside the evidence bag. Only after that did he pull on gloves and lift the drive. "You kept it exactly as he gave it to you," Conrad said, looking at Leo. "Untouched, unsealed, unexamined. That matters enormously in terms of what we can do with it." Leo let out a long breath through his nose. The relief in it was audible, months of it compressed and releasing all at once. "I thought about opening it 100 times," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I kept thinking that if I knew what was on it, I could do something. Prepare somehow." He shook his head. "But every time I got close to it, I thought about what Michael said, and I just put it back." "You made the right call," I said. "Every time." Conrad connected the right blocker to his laptop and then plugged the drive in. He explained briefly and clearly that the imaging process would run between 20 and 40 minutes. While the progress bar moved across the screen, he turned to Leo. "The phone videos," he said. Leo was already pulling out his phone. He scrolled back through his camera roll a long way back and held the screen toward Conrad. 3 videos each between 12 and 20 seconds, filmed from a doorway or around a corner with the careful, motionless patience of someone trying not to be seen or heard. In each one, Michael's hand moved across a combination panel mounted on a wall safe in what was clearly my study at Oak Park. 2 of the 3 angles were sharp enough to read every digit of the 5-number sequence as Michael's fingers pressed them. Conrad watched each video twice without speaking. Then he read out an encrypted email address from his notebook and asked Leo to send all 3 videos there immediately, without deleting the originals from the device. "Keep the phone as it is," Conrad said. "The original files on the phone and the sent copies both form part of the chain. Don't delete, don't edit, don't show anyone else." Leo sent the videos, waited for Conrad's confirmation of receipt, and set the phone face down on the table. "Why did you film it?" I asked. I wasn't challenging him. I genuinely needed to understand. Leo looked at his phone for a moment before answering. "Because everything else Michael did was planned," he said. "Every visit, every conversation, it always felt like he'd rehearsed it. But with the safe, he'd get focused on what he was doing and forget to check if I was in the hallway. It was the only moment where he seemed like he wasn't thinking about being watched." He looked up at me. "So I started watching. I told myself I didn't know why, but I think I knew." The drive finished imaging at 37 minutes. Conrad ejected it, resealed it in a new evidence bag, initialed the seal, and set it at the center of the table. He typed for a moment and then stopped. He went very still. "Arthur," he said. I leaned forward to look at the screen. The forensic images directory had loaded a file tree organized into 3 top-level folders, arranged with the precision of someone who returns to things regularly and needs to find them quickly. Conrad pointed to each folder name in sequence without opening any of them. "Financial, legal, medical." He pulled his hand back from the keyboard. "This is not a storage drive. This is an archive, structured, intentional, built to be navigated." He looked at me across the table, his voice dropping half a register. "Whoever put this together was keeping records across all 3 categories, deliberately and over time." Leo's face drained of color slowly at first, then all at once the way color leaves when an abstract dread suddenly acquires a shape it can occupy. I sat back, looked at the screen for a moment longer. Then I looked at Conrad. 10 days, I said. 10 days after leaving Leo's apartment with a sealed evidence bag and a file structure I hadn't opened, Conrad Mallory called me at 6 in the evening and said 4 words. "Come in, bring coffee." I stopped at a place on Michigan Avenue that stayed open late and arrived at his office with 2 cups at 6:20. He was at his desk with the main monitor angled away from the door, and he turned it toward me when I sat down. He had printed nothing. Everything was on screen, which told me he had not yet decided how much of this should exist on paper in his office. He walked me through it in order. The emails came first. 14 messages between Michael and Voss exchanged over a 6-week period using 2 private accounts that had both since been deactivated, but which Conrad's contacts had been able to subpoena from the service provider, with Detective Webb's preliminary filing as legal basis. The emails detailed the request, the terms, the agreed payment structure, the specific language Michael wanted used in the document. Voss had pushed back once in the third message, a short, anxious paragraph suggesting a different framing. Michael had replied in 2 sentences that left no room for negotiation. I read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then Conrad showed me the contract templates. 6 variations on the Whitfield capital transfer documents in various stages of draft, each one carrying the forged signature in slightly different states of refinement. Early drafts, rougher later ones polished to a precision that matched what Ed Crane had flagged in January. A record of the work. Someone had kept the drafts. I was holding the coffee cup and realized at some point that I had not taken a sip from it. The financial chain, Conrad said. He turned to the second monitor. This took the longest to reconstruct because it was the most carefully layered. 3 intermediate wire transfers, each passing through a separate account at a different regional bank before the funds cleared into the Cayman Trust structure. He pulled up a diagram he had made himself, a simple flowchart, boxes and arrows. The source account at the beginning of the chain is a personal savings account, joint account, Naperville, Illinois. He pointed to the name at the top of the diagram, Gerald and Diane Colton. The withdrawal pattern, Conrad said, accounts for the full amount we identified moved out over 11 months through the same structured routing. The room did not change around me. The light was the same, the hum of the monitors was the same. Conrad's voice maintained its measured, professional register. And yet something shifted in the quality of the air in a way I could not have described to anyone who hadn't felt it themselves. Gerald Colton, I said, 61 years old, works as a licensed building contractor in DuPage County, has operated his own small business for 22 years. Conrad's voice was even and precise, the way it was when he was delivering information that required him to remain professional. That savings account shows 31 years of consistent deposits. The balance before the transfers began was $348,000. The withdrawal pattern matches the stated story that the funds were earmarked for mortgage payoff on their Naperville property, a home the Coltons have owned since 1993. He looked at me. The mortgage balance at the start of last year was approximately $319,000. Among the earliest withdrawals, Conrad said, his voice dropping half a register, was a transfer of $200,000. Timed to the exact week Michael told you it had been paid to the Coltons as a good faith guarantee. 31 years. A man who built things with his hands for 31 years had been saving the money that would finally make the house his, and someone had redirected it into a Cayman Islands trust account registered to a shell company bearing my name. I set the coffee cup on the edge of Conrad's desk. Carefully. The way you set something down when your hands are doing something complicated that you don't want anyone else to notice. I'll take copies of everything, I said. I need to read through it properly. I was home by 9. I read until 3 in the morning. I sat at my desk with the printed documents spread across the surface, and I read each one twice and in some cases 3 times, not because the information was unclear, but because I needed the full weight of it to settle before I could decide what to do with it. At some point, I turned the family photograph on my desk face down. Not from anger, I wasn't sure what I felt was anger exactly, but because I needed to look at the papers without anything else in my field of vision. At 2:45, I opened Margaret's journal. I found a blank page near the back, the same page where I had written no in January, and I wrote beneath it. He took money from a man who spent his whole life earning it. I don't know where I failed, but I know what I have to do. I closed the journal, went to bed, lay on my back in the dark and looked at the ceiling until the sky outside began to change color. At 6 in the morning, I got dressed and drove to St. Clement Church in Lincoln Park. Father Thomas Brennan had been the parish priest at St. Clement for 11 years, a lean, direct man in his early 60s, who had known Margaret as a parishioner for most of that time, and who had the uncommon quality, in someone of his vocation, of knowing when not to offer comfort and when to simply be present. I had sat in that church 3 times since Margaret died. He had never once told me what to feel. He was on the front steps when I pulled up, sweeping fallen leaves from the entry with a long-handled broom in the thin, early morning light. He looked at me coming up the walk and set the broom against the railing without a word. We went inside. The nave was empty and cold. We sat in the 3rd pew from the front, not at the altar, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Not the silence of men who have nothing to say, but the brief working silence of 2 people settling into a conversation that requires a proper starting point. She would have known what to say to him, I said finally. Margaret. She always knew how to reach Michael in ways I didn't. Brennan folded his hands on the back of the pew in front of him and looked straight ahead. She would have said what you already know, Arthur, he said. You don't need the right words. You've never needed words, you need courage. You've always had more of that than you gave yourself credit for. He paused. You drove here at 6 in the morning instead of sitting at home with it. That tells me you've already decided. I sat with that for a minute. He wasn't wrong. I drove home at 7, made coffee that I actually drank this time, and called Conrad. Set up a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office, I said. The Northern District of Illinois. Whoever handles wire fraud and financial crimes at the federal level. Conrad would know that meant the Assistant U.S. Attorney, the federal prosecutors who handle cases within their district, with authority to pursue charges that cross state lines and involve federal statutes. Tell Garrett to certify everything he has in hard copy. I want 2 sets. Conrad acknowledged and then paused. One more thing, he said, and his voice had a different quality considered careful. The safe at your house. The combination Leo documented. I've been thinking about it. A brief pause. There may come a moment when what's inside matters. I don't know when, but keep it in mind. I held the phone for a second after he said that. I'll keep it in mind, I said. I put the phone down. Opened Margaret's journal one more time. Read the last 3 sentences I had written. Closed it. Stood up from the desk for the first time since sitting down at 9 the night before. Outside my study window, Chicago was awake and moving. I watched it for a moment. Then I went to get ready for the day. 5 days after I called Conrad to set up the Kowalski meeting, my phone rang at 7 in the evening. I had been at my desk reviewing the certified copies Garrett had delivered the day before, cross-referencing them against the timeline Conrad and I had reconstructed from the drive. The number on my screen was not one I recognized, a 630 area code, DuPage County. I answered. Whitfield. The voice was rough-edged and deliberate, carrying the particular flatness of a man who has decided not to be polite. This is Gerald Colton, Emily's father. I set down my pen. In 18 months of knowing my son was engaged to this man's daughter, I had spoken to Gerald Colton exactly once, briefly, at a firm dinner a year and a half ago, a handshake and 4 sentences about the weather and the drive from Naperville. I had no reference for what his phone voice sounded like, and that I understood in the first 20 seconds of the call was precisely why this moment had been chosen. I'm glad you called, I said carefully. I'm not calling to be glad about. The voice pressed forward, controlled anger, each word weighted. I'm calling because Michael told us what you've been doing. Calling around. asking questions, trying to find reasons to tear this wedding apart because you can't stand that your son chose someone outside your little circle. A pause timed for effect. Emily doesn't want you there. I don't want you there. And if you try to make this difficult, I will make it very difficult for you. Are we clear? I listened to the next 40 seconds without interrupting. And while I listened, the lawyer's part of my brain, that never fully stops working, began to tick through things that were wrong. The phrasing, "your little circle," was not the idiom of a man who had spent 30 years in construction and contracting. It was the phrasing of someone who had rehearsed it. The cadence was too even anger performed rather than felt, has a smoothness to it, the way a practiced witness has a smoothness that a genuine one doesn't. And there was a specific word, reparations, dropped halfway through a sentence about what I owed the family, a word that no contractor from DuPage County would place in that sentence in that way. I let the call finish. I said flatly and without inflection, "Thank you for reaching out." And I ended it. Then I called Conrad. "Unknown 630 number," I said. "Someone claiming to be Gerald Colton. VoIP, almost certainly the audio quality had that compression signature. I need the originating IP." Conrad asked me 3 questions in quick succession. The exact time of the call, the number, whether I still had it on screen, and said he would submit an emergency subpoena request to the carrier immediately. Under federal law, a service provider can be compelled to release subscriber and session data in response to a properly filed request tied to an active criminal investigation, which Webb's preliminary filing gave Conrad the legal standing to initiate. The process, Conrad said, would take 90 minutes at most. I sat at my desk for those 90 minutes. I did not read anything. I simply sat. Conrad called back at 8:47. "The originating IP routes to a residential address in Chicago's West Loop," he said. "Detective Webb ran it through the system. The account is registered to a name associated with Michael Whitfield's professional address of record." He paused 1 beat. "Wire fraud and identity impersonation, 18 U.S.C. 1028 and 1343. Webb is adding both to the file tonight." I thanked Conrad and put the phone in my pocket. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I got in the car. I drove to Naperville. I don't know exactly what I expected to find, or what I thought arriving there would accomplish. I parked on the street across from the Colton house at 9:30, a 2-story colonial on a quiet block, the kind of house that takes decades to look the way it looks. The kitchen window was lit from inside with the warm yellow light of a room where someone is living their evening. Through the front window, I could see the blue flicker of a television. A shadow moved in the kitchen. Gerald and Diane Colton, going about Tuesday evening, not knowing. I sat in the car for 22 minutes. A neighbor walked a dog past the front of the house. The kitchen light went off and then back on. The television kept flickering. These were the people whose life savings Michael had redirected into a trust account in the Cayman Islands. Gerald had poured concrete and laid floors and managed a crew of workers for 31 years, setting aside what he could week by week toward the day the house would be fully his. And somewhere in that patient, ordinary accumulation of money and time, someone had identified the account and decided it was available. I started the car and drove home. Helen was in the kitchen when I came through the back door. The kettle was already on. She had a habit of hearing my car before I was through the gate, a kind of domestic radar developed over 20 years. She looked at my face when I came in and asked no questions. She poured 2 cups without asking whether I wanted one, and set them on the kitchen table and sat down across from me. "Something happened," she said. It wasn't a question. "Someone made a phone call pretending to be Emily's father," I said. She absorbed this without visible reaction. Then she set down her cup and looked at me with the expression of a woman who has decided, after a long time of not deciding, that the right moment has arrived. "Sir." she said. Can I tell you something I should have told you a long time ago? Yes, I said. The day of Mrs. Whitfield's funeral, the reception was at the Holloway's house. You were there for nearly 3 hours. She held her cup with both hands. Michael came back here. He let himself in. I was in the kitchen, and I heard him go into your study. She stopped. I went to check. He was sitting in your chair behind your desk. He sat in it for the better part of an hour, sir, just looking at the room. Her voice was steady, but the effort it was taking to keep it steady was visible in the way she was holding the cup. When he left, he thanked me politely and told me to enjoy the rest of the evening, like nothing had happened. My right hand moved without my instruction and pressed flat against the table surface. Why didn't you tell me? I said. The question came out quiet. Because you had just buried your wife, she said. You were already carrying something that would have broken most men, sir. I didn't want to be the one who added to it. And every year, after every year, I thought the right moment had passed, that bringing it up then would only disturb something that had settled. She pressed her lips together. This year I understood there would be no right moment, only a necessary one. She exhaled slowly. I've wanted to tell you for 8 years. I'm telling you now because I think you can hold it now, and because I think you need to know who you are actually dealing with. I looked at the tea. Let the words land where they were going to land. Michael had sat in my chair the day we buried his mother. Not grief, not comfort-seeking. He had sat in my chair and looked at my room and taken some kind of private inventory, and then he had thanked Helen politely and driven away. I stood up from the table. Thank you, Helen, I said, for then and for now. I went to the study, sat in my chair, opened Margaret's journal, wrote nothing, just sat, and understood clearly and completely that it was time to take the next step. 3 weeks after Conrad confirmed the fake phone call, I did something he had advised against. I had asked him early in March to find out who Emily Colton was closest to, not professionally, not socially, in the broad sense, but the one person she would call at 2 a.m. if something went wrong. Conrad had come back within 48 hours with the name Brooke Tanner, 28 years old, a landscape architect who had been Emily's friend since their first year at Northwestern. He had described her as someone with a watchful, pragmatic disposition who had, in Conrad's careful phrasing, expressed private reservations about the engagement to at least 2 mutual acquaintances in the last 4 months. I had reached out to Brooke through the law firm's public contact line. She had responded within an hour. We had spoken for 12 minutes. By the end of the call, she had agreed to arrange a meeting, a casual coffee framed to Emily as something between a courtesy and a curiosity, and had asked me only one question before she agreed. Are you trying to stop the wedding, or are you trying to protect her? I had thought about that for a moment. Then I said, both of those things may be the same thing. She had been quiet for a few seconds and then said, Tuesday at 9, Andersonville. I'll send you the address. I arrived at the cafe 12 minutes early. It was a narrow room on Clark Street with brick walls and mismatched chairs and good light from east-facing windows. The kind of place that fills up slowly and quietly on weekday mornings, populated mostly by people who need to think about something without being interrupted. I took a table near the back and ordered black coffee and sat with my hands around the cup and noticed that my hands were not entirely still. I had not been nervous before a meeting since my 2nd year of practice. I found the sensation unpleasant and informative in equal measure. Brooke Tanner came through the door at 8:56. I recognized her from the photo Conrad had included in his brief early 30s, dark coat carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder with the precise economical movements of someone accustomed to navigating spaces efficiently. She looked at me across the room, gave a small, deliberate nod, and sat down at a table near the window, angling her chair so she could see both the door and where I was sitting. She did not come over to speak. Emily arrived at 9 exactly. I recognized her immediately, though the last time I had seen her, it had been briefly at a crowded dinner a year and a half ago, and she had not known I was watching. She came through the door in a deep blue coat, shaking a few drops of rain from her sleeve, and looked around the room with an expression that was open and slightly wary in the way of someone entering a situation they have agreed to without being entirely sure why. When her eyes found me, she smiled genuinely, not politely, and that particular quality of genuine warmth arriving before she had any reason to offer it told me something about her that Michael's description had not prepared me for. She ordered tea at the counter and brought it to the table herself. "I appreciate you meeting me," I said. "Brooke said it would be worth the time." She wrapped both hands around her cup, a gesture I recognized from someone else from a kitchen table in Wicker Park, and the recognition made something shift in my chest. "She didn't tell me much, just that you wanted to talk." She looked at me with clear, direct eyes. "Michael said you were difficult. I wanted to see for myself." "That seems like a reasonable approach," I said. She smiled briefly at that. "He also said you were smart," which I took as a warning to pay attention. We talked for a while about straightforward things. The wedding logistics, her work as an events coordinator, how she and Michael had met at a colleague's birthday dinner in Wicker Park 3 years ago. She spoke about him with affection that was real and unperformed, and I listened to it the way I listened to things I needed to hold carefully without reacting to. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a sharp, honest, warm person who had not yet been given a reason to question what she had been told. I moved slowly. "Your work sounds demanding," I said, "managing multiple accounts at once. Do you and Michael divide the financial responsibilities, or does he handle most of it independently?" She considered. "He handles a lot of it. He's better at that side of things than I am, honestly. He's been talking about some investment structures for after the wedding, long-term planning, consolidating some assets." She lifted her cup. "He mentioned something called Whitfield Capital a few months ago. Said it was related to the family holdings." Her hand stopped halfway through bringing the cup to her mouth. It stopped for perhaps 1 full second. Then she completed the motion, took a sip, and looked at me with an expression that had acquired a very small, very precise amount of new caution behind the openness. "Is that right?" I said evenly. "He was vague about the details," she said. Her voice was still steady, but the temperature of the conversation had shifted by a degree or two in the way rooms shift when a window opens that wasn't open before. "Should I know more about it? If your name is going to be on anything associated with it," I said, "then yes. I'd encourage you to ask him directly and to ask to see the documentation." She looked at me for a moment. Processing. The intelligent wariness she had come in with was doing something more active now. I gave her time with it. "There's one other thing I want to ask you," I said, "and you can answer however you'd like." I kept my tone unhurried and neutral. "Has Michael ever shown you any medical documentation concerning my health? Any records, any clinical summaries?" Emily set her cup down. She looked at the table for a moment, not evasively, but in the way people look when they are deciding something, and then she looked back at me. "No," she said. It was 1 syllable. It came out a third of a second slower than the rest of her answers had come, and she held my gaze a fraction longer than she had throughout the rest of the conversation, which was the response of someone who has understood that the question means more than its surface and is choosing deliberately not to go further with it right now. I had cross-examined witnesses for 35 years. I knew the difference between a person who doesn't know something and a person who is deciding whether to say it. I stood up when we had finished our coffee. "Whatever you hear about me from anyone," I said, "I hope you'll measure it against what you've seen in this room this morning." She looked at me with eyes that were doing several things at once. "I'm good at measuring things," she said. I left first. On the way out, I passed Brooke Tanner's table. She didn't speak. She raised her cup half an inch in a gesture that contained more than I expected acknowledgement, something close to relief and something that might have been gratitude. I walked out onto Clark Street into the thin April rain. In the car, I called Conrad. "I met her," I said. "And," he said. I looked through the wet windshield at the street. "She's not what Michael told anyone she was. She's clear-eyed and careful, and she already knows something isn't right. She just hasn't let herself follow that thread yet." I pulled out of the parking space. She knows more than she's showing. I could see it. Conrad took that in. "She'll get there," he said. "People like that always do. The question is whether she gets there before June 21st. "That's the question," I said. I drove back through the April rain with that question sitting on the seat beside me the whole way home. 4 days after the cafe, Brooke Tanner called me at 8:30 in the evening. I had been in the study going through the certified copies Garrett had prepared, not reading them for new information, because there was no new information left to find, but reviewing the sequence again with the careful attention of a man checking the architecture of something that needs to hold under pressure. When my phone rang and the screen showed Brooke's name, I felt the particular alertness that comes when you have been waiting for something without having named it to yourself. "Mr. Whitfield." Her voice had a different quality than it had in our earlier conversation, tighter, more urgent, moving through the words at a pace that told me something had already happened, and she was processing it in real time. "Emily confronted Michael last night. About Whitfield Capital. About what you said in the cafe." I set down the papers. "Tell me what happened." She walked me through it. Emily had come home from a friend's dinner, sat down with Michael, and asked him directly, calmly, she said, because that was how Emily did things, what exactly Whitfield Capital was, and whether her name was associated with it in any way. Michael had responded, Brooke told me, with tears. Not anger, not denial, tears, and a long practiced accounting of how Arthur Whitfield had spent months attempting to sabotage the engagement, how Emily was being manipulated without knowing it, how the cafe meeting had been exactly what he had warned her it would be. "She almost went back," Brooke said. Her voice carried the specific strain of a person watching someone they love make a decision they cannot stop. She was sitting there listening to him cry, and I could hear it in her voice when she called me. She almost just let it go. "But she didn't," I said. "She called her dad." Brooke exhaled. "From what Emily told me, she asked Gerald directly whether there was any investment account in his name connected to Arthur Whitfield or a company called Whitfield Capital. Gerald said no. He said he didn't know what she was talking about." A pause. And that changed something. Emily said that Gerald's voice on the phone sounded like a man who genuinely had no idea what she was asking about. And Emily knows her father's voice. I was quiet for a moment, not from having nothing to say, but from needing to let what she was describing settle fully before I responded. Gerald Colton, sitting somewhere in Naperville on an ordinary Tuesday evening, receiving a call from his daughter that made no sense to him because the account bearing his name, the 31 years of savings, the $312,000, had moved without his knowledge and without his consent. He had no frame of reference for the question Emily was asking. That ignorance, that authentic bafflement in his voice had been the thing that finally cracked something open. "After that call," Brooke continued, "Emily went into the apartment closet. I waited. She found a folder, medical, your name on it." Brooke's voice was careful now, choosing words. "She called me at midnight. She was the way she sounded was the way people sound after something breaks rather than after something surprises them. She said..." Brooke stopped for a moment. "She said, Brooke, someone made this up about Arthur. Someone put a lot of work into making this up, and I've been looking at it for months without knowing what it was. The folder. The Voss Medical Associates report. It had been in Michael's apartment, in their apartment, sitting in a closet, and Emily had found it in the small hours of a Wednesday morning, and had understood alone in that apartment with the document in her hands, what she was looking at. I thought about that for a moment. A young woman who had spent the last 18 months being carefully constructed, as someone afraid of me who had found the instrument of that construction in her own home and had called her best friend instead of her fiancé. "Is she all right?" I asked. "She's quiet," Brooke said. "The kind of quiet that isn't upset. It's the kind that means she's thinking very hard." "That's the right kind," I said. I kept my voice level and clear. "Tell her something for me. Tell her when she's ready, she'll know what to do. Don't push her toward anything and don't explain. Just be there." Brooke was quiet for a moment. "Then, okay," she said. "Okay." After we hung up, I sat in the study without turning any pages. I looked at the window. Outside Chicago in mid-April was doing what it always did at this time of year, cycling through cold and rain and occasional light, without committing to any of them, a city that takes its time deciding what kind of spring it's going to be. I thought about Emily in that apartment at midnight, holding a one-page document that claimed her future father-in-law had a degenerating mind, understanding that it had been placed there for a purpose, and choosing with no one to tell her what the right choice was, to look at it clearly rather than put it away. I had liked her in the cafe. In this moment I respected her. 2 days later, Conrad called at mid-morning. "Arthur," he said, and his voice had a particular quality that I had come to recognize as the voice he used when the news was significant and unambiguously good. "Kowalski's office received a message 2 days ago. Anonymous email encrypted. Attached photographs, a medical folder bearing your name, Voss Medical Associates, letterhead, the whole document." He paused one beat. "They verified the photographs are authentic. The folder matches the document in Voss's affidavit." I stood up from my desk. "Emily sent them," I said. "It was not a question." "I know who sent them," Conrad said, "and so do you." I walked to the window of my study and looked out at the street below, the ordinary mid-morning movement of Oak Park going about its business, oblivious and unhurried. A woman I had sat across from in a cafe 4 days ago who had said no, a third of a second too slowly, to a question about a medical folder, had photographed that folder alone at midnight and sent it to a federal prosecutor's office. Without being asked. Without knowing the full shape of what she was contributing to. "There's one thing left I haven't done," I said to Conrad. "Naperville," he said. "Naperville," I confirmed. "It's time to go to the door." 3 weeks after the call with Conrad, I drove to Naperville in the afternoon, not at night. Not to park on the opposite side of the street and watch the lights from a distance, which is what I had done in March. This time I drove in with the sun still above the rooftops, and when I pulled up in front of the Colton house, I turned off the engine and went directly to the door. I knocked twice. Gerald Colton answered within the minute. He was broader than I expected, built solidly through the shoulders and chest, in the way that men build themselves when they have spent decades doing physical work. Not the gym-manufactured breadth of a younger man, but the settled, durable kind that accumulates over time. He was 61 years old, and he looked like every year of it without apology. He looked at my face when he opened the door, and recognition moved through his expression, not warmth, not hostility, but the careful, calibrated wariness of a man who has been told something about you and is now deciding how much of it to believe. "I know who you are, Mr. Whitfield," he said. "I assumed you would," I said. "Michael's a thorough person." I kept my hands at my sides and my voice even. "I'm not here to argue with anything he's told you. I'm here because I have documentation here that concerns your family, and I believe you have the right to see it. I'm asking for 1 hour. What you do with what I show you in that hour is entirely your decision." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. His eyes moved over my face with the unhurried assessment of a man who spent his working life reading job sites for structural problems, looking for the thing that wasn't right before it became expensive. I did not fill the silence with more words. I had learned a long time ago that adding words to a moment like this only gives the other person something to argue against. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The kitchen was at the back of the house, a large, clean room that smelled of coffee and the kind of cooking that happens at the same hour every evening out of habit rather than occasion. He gestured to a chair at the table. I sat. He sat across from me. Neither of us said anything while I opened my briefcase and began laying the certified documents across the table in the sequence I had planned. First the shell company registration, then the ownership chain, then the forged contracts and the practice signature page, and finally the bank transfer records. I talked him through each element in the same order. Steadily, without rushing the way I walked a jury through complex financial evidence, because the goal was not to overwhelm, it was to illuminate. When I reached the transfer records and slid the final page across the table, I watched his face. He looked at his own account number. He knew it the way a man knows a number he has looked at for 3 decades. The routing code, the last 4 digits, the format of the statement. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been flat on the table, moved without any apparent instruction from him and turned palms up in front of him, large, calloused hands with the permanent creases of a man who had spent 22 years mixing mortar and pulling wire and driving screws into things that needed to be permanent. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at the bank record, and then he looked at the wall. He said nothing for what must have been 20 seconds. Then he called toward the hallway, "Diane." His wife appeared from the direction of the living room, a trim, composed woman in her late 50s with the quiet alertness of someone who has learned to read the register of her husband's voice across decades of a shared life. She took in the table, the documents, and me in a single sweeping look. "Sit down, honey," Gerald said. She sat. I turned the relevant pages toward her without speaking and let her read. She read the way intelligent people read things they were not expecting, carefully going back over sentences, her finger moving along the lines, without touching the paper. When she reached the bank transfer summary, a sound came from her, not a word, not quite a cry, something compressed and involuntary, the sound of a breath that had nowhere to go. She looked at Gerald. He was looking at the wall. 31 years. She said very quietly. "I know," he said. They sat with it for a moment, not theatrically, not with collapse, but with the particular battered dignity of 2 people who have learned that absorbing bad news is a skill like any other, developed through repetition. Then Gerald looked at me. His eyes were steady, and his voice, when it came, was measured in the deliberate way of a man who has decided to be useful rather than destroyed. "You're planning to do this at the wedding," he said. It was not a question. It had the flat, declarative quality of a man who has already worked through the logic and arrived at the only place it goes. I could have deflected. I chose not to. "It's the venue that makes it impossible to deny afterward," I said. 200 people, a federal judge officiating. No one can claim the evidence was fabricated in a back room. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He looked at Diane. She gave him a small, firm nod that said more than a full sentence would have. He stood up and extended his hand across the table. "Then we're doing it together," he said. "You tell us what you need from us, and we'll be there." I stood and took his hand. His grip was the grip of a man who had spent his life building things that lasted. I held it for 1 full second longer than a formal handshake required. "Thank you, Gerald," I said. "I mean that completely." He walked me to the front door. The evening had come in while we were at the table, and the street outside was darker than when I had arrived. As I reached the car, I noticed headlights 2 blocks back that had been there when I turned in. Conrad had arranged for Detective Webb to park at a discreet distance, a precaution, in case the visit had gone differently than it did. The headlights did not move until mine did. I drove back toward Chicago with the lights of Naperville receding in my mirrors, and 2 things settled firmly in my chest: the weight of what Gerald had absorbed across that kitchen table, and the particular focused calm that comes when the final pieces of something are in place. A week after Naperville, I walked into the Dirksen Federal Building on South Dearborn for the first time in my career without a client beside me. I had represented defendants in that building in a dozen different federal proceedings over the years. White-collar fraud securities, violations, tax evasion. I knew the lobby, the elevator banks, the particular quality of institutional silence in the upper floor corridors. What I did not know was how it felt to come through those doors carrying the other side's case. It felt unexpectedly like relief. A USA Janet Kowalski had the compact, unhurried energy of a person who had been doing exactly this kind of work for long enough to have stopped being theatrical about it. She was 44, with short, dark hair, and the evaluating eyes of someone who read documents at twice the speed of most people and retained them at the same rate. She shook my hand once briefly and gestured to the chair across her desk without small talk. She spent 20 minutes reading the case file before she said anything. I did not fill the time. When she looked up, she asked one question: why the wedding? Because a federal arrest executed in the presence of 200 witnesses and before an officiating federal judge is not something that can be characterized afterward as manufactured or coerced, I said. There is no back room, no private arrangement, no gap in the record. Every person in that room becomes a witness to the manner of the arrest, the orderly presentation of certified evidence, and the absence of any procedural violation. It removes every avenue of subsequent challenge that a competent defense attorney would otherwise attempt. Kowalski studied me for a moment. You think like a prosecutor, Mr. Whitfield. I've spent 35 years on the defense side, I said. I know precisely what a good prosecutor does because I've spent my career working around it. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but its functional equivalent. She turned back to the file. She asked 4 more questions over the following 30 minutes, each one precise and purposeful, the questions of a person who already understood the architecture and was checking the load-bearing walls. When she reached the section on the medical records, she paused. My office received photographs approximately 6 weeks ago, she said without looking up. An anonymous, encrypted submission. A medical folder bearing your name, Voss Medical Associates. We've verified the authenticity. It matches the affidavit on file. I know, I said. She looked at me. Do you know who sent them? Yes, I said. A beat. She did not pursue it. She turned another page. Before I left, she said, I'll coordinate with Detective Webb and CPD on pre-filing the arrest warrant. The warrant will be ready to execute on your signal. You understand that once I submit the warrant request to the duty judge, the timeline is fixed. We move on June 21st, regardless of whether the ceremony starts on time, regardless of any last-minute change of plan. Understood, I said. June 21st. She stood. Mr. Whitfield, for what it's worth, this is a well-constructed file. You did the work correctly. I had help, I said. The 6 weeks between that meeting and the wedding were the strangest of the entire year. Ed Crane ran the firm without being told, to rescheduling what needed rescheduling, managing the partners' calendar questions, without involving me asking nothing in return and expecting nothing to be explained. Garrett had 2 complete certified copies of the full case file ready before the end of May, sealed, labeled, delivered to my house in a locked document case. Conrad filed a status update with Webb every Monday. The machinery moved quietly, as it is supposed to, toward the fixed point of June 21st. I visited Rose Hill Cemetery on the first Wednesday of June. The weather that day was overcast and cool, in the way of a Chicago early summer that hasn't decided what it wants to be. I stood at Margaret's grave and didn't ask for anything. I had come to ask for guidance in March, and Father Brennan had given me what he could. This time I came simply to be there, to stand in that particular patch of earth that contained the person who had known me longer and more completely than anyone alive, and to say something before the silence on the other side of Wednesday morning became a different kind of silence. "It's almost over," I said quietly. "I don't know if I could have changed how any of this went. I've stopped trying to answer that." I stood with it for a moment. "Leo wants to study law. I only just found that out. There's something on the other side of all this that I'd like to be present for." I placed white flowers at the base of the stone and drove back toward the city. On the afternoon of June 19th, coming out of the federal building, after a brief final coordination meeting with Kowalski's office, I passed Father Thomas Brennan on the sidewalk outside. He was there apparently for a different matter entirely, something involving a diocese permit, he said. And we stopped for 30 seconds in the way people stop when the occasion doesn't require more, but the feeling does. He looked at my face in the way he always looked at faces, which was thoroughly and without pretense. "Tomorrow, Arthur," he said. "Tomorrow, Thomas," I said. At 2 in the morning on June 20th, I walked into my study and found Helen Gordy already there. She had made 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of the chair I always sat in, and one in front of the chair on the opposite side, a chair that was almost never used, that sat against the bookshelves in the corner, and served mostly as a surface for stacked papers. She had cleared those papers and was sitting in it when I came through the door, her hands wrapped around her cup, her posture straight in the way of someone who has been awake for a while and is not bothered by it. I sat in my chair. "You didn't have to wait up," I said. "I know I didn't." She looked at me without apology. "I wanted to." I picked up the coffee. We sat in the quiet of a house that had been quiet for 8 years, not the absence of noise quiet of a building at 2 in the morning, but the older, deeper quiet of rooms that have been emptied of something essential. In a handful of hours, the version of that quiet that had been associated with powerlessness, with sitting at a desk and knowing something was wrong and not yet knowing how to address it, was going to end one way or another. "Helen," I said. "Sir," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, however it goes." I looked at her across the desk. "Thank you for the 8 years, for staying." She held her cup for a moment, and then she said plainly and without sentiment, "She chose this house, sir. I chose it too. That doesn't change based on what happens on a particular Tuesday." I finished the coffee, stood up, put on my jacket. I stood in the doorway of the study for a moment, looking at the room. The bookshelves, the framed accolades that I had stopped seeing the green leather journal in the open desk drawer. The room that I had sat alone in on the night a cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail, when I had written 4 words on the first blank page I could find, and had not yet known what I was going to do with them. I turned off the light, walked to the front door, stepped out into the last hours of June 20th. "Tomorrow, before I take you inside that ballroom and reveal what Arthur did, comment 15 to let me know you're still with me." I read every single one. One final note: what follows contains fictional elements added for educational purposes. Some details may not align precisely with events as they occurred. If that's not for you, this is a graceful place to step away. But if you're ready, so am I. June 21st came in on clear light, and a sky that had finally decided to be summer. I had been dressed since 5. I stood in the kitchen at 6 and drank coffee while the city came awake, then picked up my briefcase. It contained the sealed envelope. Garrett had prepared 2 certified sets of the case file and walked out to the car. The Langham Chicago sits on East Walker Drive, chosen by people who want everything to be remembered. The doorman opened the entrance without asking. I arrived with the posture of someone who belongs. The lobby was moving with a wedding day's current florists, a woman with a clipboard, guests comparing parking tickets. I crossed toward the elevators and saw Leo near the concierge desk in a dark suit that fit him better than the last hands in pockets. His posture was composed. Our eyes met just long enough. "I'm here. I'm ready." Then he looked away. Conrad was in a service corridor off the main floor, jacket buttoned. Webb is in position with 2 officers at the west entrance, he said quietly. The warrant was signed at 7:42. Webb enters at the coordinated moment when the ceremony reaches the objection. You rise, you speak. He moves as planned. Say enough that the room understands this is not a personal dispute. He looked at me. The moment you stand up, the room becomes the record. I know, I said. You built this correctly. I walked into the Crystal Ballroom at 11:42. 218 people sat in ivory-covered chairs before a floral arch, 3 days in the making. Tall windows let June light fall in long gold columns across the polished floor. I took a seat 6 rows from the front near the outer aisle. 4 rows ahead and to the right, Gerald and Diane Colton. Gerald in a suit pressed carefully worn with the quiet dignity of his Naperville handshake. Michael walked to the altar at 12:05. Charcoal suit, perfect posture. The exact expression of a man performing happiness, convincingly enough that the performance had probably become the thing itself. He scanned the room. His eyes passed over my row, then came back. 1 second, the performance held completely. Then he looked forward. The adjustment was microscopic. Nobody would have caught it. I had caught it. Federal Judge Harriet Morrison entered and took her position at the arch. The room straightened. The doors at the back opened. Gerald Colton walked his daughter down the aisle. Emily wore white without ornament, deliberate simplicity that made everyone around her look overdressed. She walked with her arm through Gerald's eyes forward, beautiful, in the unperformed way of someone not thinking about being looked at. Halfway down the aisle, she looked up and found my face directly without searching. 1 second. The composure of someone committed to what they are doing and braced for what comes next. Then she looked at Michael and did not look back. Judge Morrison's voice carried through the room. The ceremony moved declarations, a reading music. I sat with my hands on my knees and watched. When she reached the traditional inquiry, her voice was even. If anyone present knows of any just cause why this marriage should not take place, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The room went quiet. I stood up. The sound of my chair on the floor was small. In a room that quiet, it was enough. Every head turned. Michael's face went through something without a name, the first visible crack in a 2-year performance. I have something to say, I said. 218 people looked at me. I waited for the room to settle. Then I spoke. My name is Arthur Whitfield. Michael is my son. This is not a family dispute, it is a federal matter. A warrant for his arrest has been signed this morning by a duty judge and will be executed here momentarily. I kept my voice at courtroom level, clear, unhurried. Conrad Mallory entered from the side door and began distributing evidence summaries along the aisle. I spoke for 3 minutes. Wire fraud, healthcare fraud. Forgery, criminal impersonation. I named Dr. Elliot Voss and the fabricated medical assessment. I described the forged signatures, the shell company, and the wire transfers from Gerald and Diane Colton's savings, $312,000, moved through 3 accounts into a Cayman Islands trust named Whitfield Capital LLC. When I said the amount, Gerald Colton stood up. He said nothing. He just stood broad and steady in a suit not made for rooms like this, and that gesture had a weight that no words would have matched. At the altar, Michael moved. Dad. His voice carried warmth aimed at the room as much as at me. This isn't the place. These are our guests. Let's go somewhere private, and I'll explain everything. No one moved toward him. Dad. 1 degree cooler. You've been building this since December. You've collected things that can be explained, and you've chosen the most public moment to... Michael! My voice did not rise. The warrant was signed at 7:42. This is not a conversation. He looked at me. The performance flickered. Not collapsed, flickered. Then he turned to Emily. She was standing where she had been throughout, beside him 2 feet away, watching his face move through its adjustments, with the measuring eyes of a woman who had spent 6 weeks arriving at a conclusion she hadn't wanted to reach. He said her name, once. She stepped back. Her hand stayed at her side. The west door opened. Detective Marcus Webb entered with 2 officers. He came to the center of the aisle and spoke with flat professionalism. "Michael Whitfield, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges including wire fraud, healthcare fraud, identity fraud, and forgery of real estate documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Michael stood at the altar for a moment. Then he straightened his jacket, both hands smoothing the lapels, composing himself. He looked at no one. His face arrived somewhere flat and unreadable. The performance had not cracked. It had ended. He walked out with Webb toward the service corridor. He did not look back. Gerald walked toward his daughter. Emily met him halfway and leaned into him, not breaking, but finally setting something down. Leo appeared beside my chair. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," I said. In the lobby of the Langham 40 minutes after the officers led Michael through the service corridor and out of the building, Leo and I stood in the warm June afternoon light, coming through the tall glass entrance doors, and did not speak for a moment. Not because there was nothing to say, there was everything to say, and we both knew it would take longer than a lobby allowed for. "Buy you lunch," he said finally. "Yes," I said. We went to a quiet Italian place on Michigan Avenue. We ordered food that neither of us particularly tasted, and we sat for 2 hours and talked properly, without agenda, without anything being either of us needed to perform. He told me about the spring semester. I told him about the filing cabinet. He told me about a professor at UIC who had changed the way he understood argument. I told him about the first case I had ever won 32 years ago in a courthouse that had since been demolished. We paid the check and walked out onto Michigan Avenue in the middle of a perfect June afternoon, and the city went about its business around us as if it had not just witnessed something irreversible 12 blocks away. The federal process moved the way federal processes move, deliberately, thoroughly, and without urgency about anything except its own internal timetables. Michael was arraigned in the Northern District of Illinois Federal Courthouse within 48 hours. He entered a plea of not guilty, which his defense attorney would have advised him to do regardless of the evidence, because that is how the process begins. Bail was denied. The presiding judge cited the Cayman Islands account structure as evidence of a flight risk, an offshore financial infrastructure of sufficient complexity to indicate premeditation, not opportunism. Michael was remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, pending trial. Dr. Elliot Voss negotiated a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors within 3 weeks. His medical license was suspended by the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. Voss had taken $47,000 from an offshore account to sign one fabricated page. The gambling debt that had made him available for that transaction was now the least of his problems. The Cayman Islands Trust account, holding the proceeds of Whitfield Capital, LLC, was subject to a court-ordered freeze coordinated between the DOJ's Office of International Affairs and the Cayman Islands Financial Reporting Authority. The process of international banking coordination would take months, but the account was frozen, nothing in, nothing out, nothing accessible. Gerald Colton retained a Naperville attorney and filed a civil recovery action against the estate of Whitfield Capital, LLC, and against Michael individually. The full amount accumulated over 31 years of work was the stated sum in his recovery claim. His attorney was competent and thorough and had handled similar cases against corporate fraud in DuPage County before. Gerald would not get it back quickly, but he would get it back. Ed Crane ran Whitfield and Associates through June and July without being formally asked to. I took a leave of absence in late June, not with a date of return, just an absence, and Ed handled everything with the same quiet, exact competence he had brought to 25 years of work for me. I called him once a week. We spoke about the firm for no more than 5 minutes before he would say, "Go do whatever you need to do and mean it." Conrad Mallory submitted his final invoice and met me at his office on the second Tuesday of July. He was behind his desk, the same binders on the wall, the same coffee maker on, and he set the invoice on the desk between us and did not push it toward me because he knew I would take it. "You know," he said, "most people in your position would have tried to handle this quietly, privately." Quietly was never going to be enough, I said. He looked at me for a moment. "No," he said, "it wasn't." He extended his hand across the desk. "It was a good piece of work, Arthur, the right kind." I shook his hand. Leo enrolled in his fall semester at UIC in August. When he called to tell me, he mentioned almost incidentally that he was changing his declared concentration toward pre-law. He said it the way young people say things they have decided before they have the courage to announce them quickly, then moving on as if the momentum of the conversation would carry it past any challenge. I let it pass without challenge. "Which area?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "Something where the facts matter." A pause. "Something where it's possible to actually fix things." I looked out the window of my study at the September trees, the oaks on the street starting to turn, the first hint of amber arriving at the tips of leaves. "That's a good place to start," I said. In September, Brooke Tanner sent me a text message. 3 words. "She's okay. Really." I read it twice and put my phone down and felt something release in my chest, a held breath I had not been aware I was holding since June 21st. 8 days later, a message arrived from a number I did not recognize. I read it once and then again, more slowly. "Thank you for giving me a reason to look." I looked at those words for a long time. Then I typed back, "You were the one who looked. I only made sure there was something to find." I put the phone down on the desk. Picked up Margaret's journal. Opened it to the page where I had written 4 words in January and "no" beneath them, and then the sentences I had written at 3 in the morning in March. There was still room on the page. I wrote one more line. "The house has been quiet for a long time. I think it might be ready for something else." I closed the journal. Outside, the October light was doing what it does in this city, slanting low and gold through the street oaks, turning everything. It touched briefly beautiful before letting it go. On my desk, the calendar showed one entry circled in ink under December 25th dinner. Leo. Oak Park. I heard Leo's voice coming from the direction of the kitchen. He had arrived an hour ago, had found the refrigerator in its usual understocked state, and had apparently decided to do something about that without being asked. The sound of him opening cabinet doors, the particular rhythm of someone making himself at home in a place he has decided belongs to him as much as to anyone. I closed the calendar, stood up from the desk. The study door was open. The hallway light was on. The house was making sounds again, the good kind, the kind that means someone else is in it. I walked toward the kitchen. Christmas came in gray and cold correctly. I had been up since 6. The garden was bare, the ground hard. The house smelled of pine wreath and fresh bread. Helen had arrived before I woke. She was setting the table when I found her. 6 place settings. "You're sitting with us this year," I said. "I was wondering when you'd ask," she said. "Now go do something useful." Leo arrived at 11:45, snow on his coat and wine under one arm. He handed Helen a paper bag with a formality that made her laugh. Her real laugh. Gerald and Diane arrived at 12:20. Gerald stepped inside and looked at the house, the foyer, the ceilings, the winter light, with the same careful attention he had once given my face in his Naperville kitchen. He extended his hand. "Arthur," he said. "Gerald," I said. "Come in." Emily came last, shaking snow from her coat. She looked at the foyer, then at me. "Your trees are beautiful in winter," she said. Simple, unrehearsed. "Come in out of the cold," I said. The table held 6 for the first time in 8 years. Helen cooked an unreasonable amount of food and sat at the end opposite me, accepting compliments briefly. Leo told a story about a missing bicycle, a mistaken identity, and a landlord who communicated only through notes slid under doors. By the end, Gerald was laughing. Diane's face was half hidden behind her wine glass. Helen's shoulders were shaking. I looked at my son across the table and thought, there he is. After dinner, Emily and I sat alone with our coffee. "I don't blame myself for the time it took," she said. "I did the right things as soon as I understood what to do." "Better than the right things," I said. She looked around the room. "Michael always made this house sound like a courtroom." She looked at me. "It doesn't." Leo proposed a toast. We raised our glasses and drank to the year. At 9, I stepped onto the front porch. The snow had stopped. I turned to look at the house. Every window had light in it. 6 people in a house built for a family that had waited 8 years for this. I thought about Margaret. Not the grief version. She would have been deeply pleased. I went back inside. After midnight, when everyone had gone, I sat at my desk and opened Margaret's journal. I read every entry through the year. Then I wrote beneath the last one. December 25th. The table held 6. The house has people in it. Leo wants to study law. I think he'll be very good at it. I'm all right, Margaret. I'm going to be all right. I closed the journal, turned off the lamp. The study went dark. The house held the warmth of the evening, the way old houses hold things patiently, as if they always knew. I walked out, closed the door, went to bed. Looking back at this family story, I'll say it plainly. I chose silence for too long, and silence wasn't peace. It was blindness. Don't be like me. Don't wait for proof before you ask the hard questions. The most difficult conversations in any family story are always the ones that should have happened years earlier. I believe God doesn't clear the path for us. He sends us the people we need to walk it. That is the truest thing I learned this year. My honest opinion, the best grandpa stories aren't the perfect ones. They're the ones brave enough to tell the truth. Every grandpa story begins with one person deciding not to look away, and every family story can survive its darkest chapter if the people inside it choose honesty over comfort. That's what I know now. If this story moved you, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Your presence here means everything. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. A note going forward. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for educational purpose. If that's not for you, step away freely. But if you're staying, I'm truly glad.